Welcome back to Depictions Media. I'm your host, Michael Clogs, and we're about to go live with the United Nations Security Council, and they're going to be speaking on threats to international peace and security and resolutions to help countries that are in that state of unrest and resolutions needed to help ensure international peace. In today, we've also heard from, of course, the United Kingdom that Queen Elizabeth II has died today, and that, of course, that country is in a state of mourning. Along with that, we still have things happening around the world, like flooding in Pakistan, that are causing needs for humanitarian efforts. Of course, Ukraine and Russia are still in a state of war, and there is also the threat of a nuclear accident because of military actions being taken near a Ukrainian nuclear power plant that has been since disabled and is powered down, while workers there are trying to keep everything going. They are pretty much so just being held as the representative in the Security Council to the United Nations from the UK has described it. They're bluntly hostages. So let's move forward as the president and representative from France is now taking the mic.
She was the longest reigning monarch in the history of the United Kingdom, and she reigned over a period of historic changes both for her country and the world. All her life was devoted to the service of her country. On behalf of the members of the Security Council, I invite everyone here to rise and observe a minute of silence in the memory of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Je vais à présent.
I will now give the floor to the Ambassador of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and I thank colleagues for this minute of silence. Many will have memories of Her Majesty the Queen during her long and distinguished reign. She will be remembered, I think, for her dedicated service at home, across the Commonwealth, and around the globe. Her extraordinary service fostered peace and friendship worldwide. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the Ambassador of the United Kingdom, and once again, I would like to repeat the condolences of the Security Council to her government. Now, the provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security. The agenda is adopted in accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure. I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Madam Izumi Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, and Madam Dragana Trifkovic, Director of the Center for Geostrategic Studies. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Madam Izumi Nakamitsu.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies and ladies and gentlemen, I have been requested to brief on the issue of, and I quote, the supply of lethal weapons to Ukraine, end of quote. It is a matter of public record that since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which started on 24th of February 2022, Ukraine has received for their defense force transfers of weapon systems and ammunition from a number of states. Information about transfers of such material has been widely publicized by the governments involved. These transfers have included heavy conventional weapons, including battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, large caliber artillery systems, and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as small arms and light weapons. There have also been widespread and independently verified reports of the transfer of major conventional weapon systems to local armed groups in Ukraine, including artillery rocket systems. As a matter of general statement, large-scale influx of weapons to conflict-affected zones raises many concerns, including potential for diversion. Those concerns should be taken with due regard, and the international community does have some instruments, such as United Nations Register of Conventional Arms, to enhance transparency in arms transfer. I encourage states to make use of those mechanisms. Beyond the matter of supply of weapons, we must focus on how these weapons are used, in particular, considering the devastating impact on civilians and civilian infrastructure caused by the use of heavy weapons in Ukraine. The Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 13,917 verified civilian casualties since 24th of February. The actual numbers are believed to be significantly higher. Most of the civilian casualties recorded were caused by the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects, including attacks by heavy artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, missiles, and aircraft. The war also continues to drive large-scale displacement, with over 9.6 million people internally displaced and over 7 million refugees recorded across Europe. The Secretary General has consistently highlighted the severe humanitarian impact of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas and has repeatedly called on parties to conflict to avoid their use in populated areas. I would like to strongly reiterate this call here today. Under international humanitarian law, combatants must not direct attacks against civilians or civilian infrastructure and take all feasible precautions in the conduct of military operations to avoid, or at least to minimize, incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. Mr. President, on 24th of August, the Secretary General addressed this Council, making the sad and tragic milestone of 6 months since the invasion of Ukraine. Throughout this period, we have witnessed tremendous devastation, with thousands of civilians killed and injured, most as a result of the use of heavy conventional weapons. The time to end this suffering is now. Let us resolve to keep working for peace in line with international law and the United Nations Charter. I thank you very much for your attention.
Je remercie.
I thank Madam Nakamitsu for her statement, and I give the floor to Madam Trifkovic.
Vous avez la parole, madame.
You have the floor, madam. If you can hear me.
You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Dear Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished members of the Security Council, at the beginning, I want to express my special respect for this high body of the World Organization and to thank you for the opportunity to speak, which at the same time I consider a great responsibility for every word spoken. When we talk about Ukraine, it's very important to look at it consistently and to take into account the arguments of both warring parties. Of great concern is the fact that one can often hear only accusations that are not supported by arguments, much less evidence. The view of the war of someone who is from Serbia and who has survived and learned about the special methods of warfare may differ from many others who do not have this experience. That is why, from the beginning, I considered the war in Ukraine to be a hybrid war and compared it to the one that was waged on the territory of the former Yugoslavia in the 90s of the last century. In terms of the external influence of the preparation of the war to the direct and indirect participation in the war through the training and arming, bringing in volunteers and commanding of the army. I will mention a few of the most important examples. The first is the case of the Croatian General Špegel, a member of the Yugoslav People's Army, who smuggled weapons into Croatia through Hungary, Austria, and Italy, armed paramilitary formations, and prepared them for attacks on members of the regular army even before the start of the war in Yugoslavia. In October 1990, the Counterintelligence Service recorded Špegel's conversation, from which it became clear that he received help from the US for these operations. The leadership of Croatia, in agreement with Slovenia, illegally imported large quantity of weapons from former Warsaw Pact countries, such as Hungary and Romania, and disarmed 100,000 of members of paramilitary formations. Another example is the arming of Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 1992 to 1990. The other, which was carried out through Croatia, but with the knowledge and approval of the American administration, George Bush, later Clinton. Bosnian Muslims were also armed during the embargo. The biggest concession to I'm sorry, can you hear me? The biggest concession to Muslims in UN protection force is permission to arm Croatian and Muslims until units under the conditions of an embargo on the import of weapons and all kinds of control was their basic task. There is evidence that even weapons from the American Ramstein base in Germany were delivered to Muslim forces in Bosnia. American Admiral Leighton Smith and French General Bertrand de la Prée in 1994 agreed that arming Serbia's neighbors was a big obligation. Is arming of Albanians by causing a rebellion in 1997 in which weapons were taken from military warehouses in Albania handed over to members of the terrorist Kosovo Liberation Army. It should be noted that Albanian separatists formed the official Kosovo Army in 2018. 1244 and Malaysia, countries such Turkey are training and arming this illegal Kosovo army. Today in Ukraine, we can also see examples of both direct interference in the conflict, where Western countries send weapons to the Ukrainian side, and the use of third countries to supply weapons to Ukraine. Recently, a Ukrainian plane that took off from Niš and was loaded with weapons crashed in Greece. Today, weapons also reach Asian and African countries. These weapons in Ukraine are killing the civilians population without choosing whether they speak Ukrainian or Russian. The Center for Geostrategic Studies, which I lead, recently sent a letter to the UN Council of Europe, the Red Cross, and other institutions. The content of the letter states the following facts. It is evident that the Ukrainian army often used prohibited cluster weapons, which it targets the civilian population in east of Ukraine. And inspection of the situation on the ground revealed target Izium with cluster bombs, which led to the death of the large number of civilians. In the Donetsk region, on July 20, several missiles attacks by the U.S. high-mobility artillery rocket system were carried out by Ukrainian army on the places of Elenovka and Alexandrovka. Attacks were carried out on civilian objects and infrastructure. Then on the night of the July 29, there was another attack by the Ukrainian army on the detonation center in Elenovka, where prisoners of war from the Azov battalion were also held. As a result, 51 people died and 75 were injured. Then on July 30, the Ukrainian army targeted the center of the densely populated city of Donetsk, which had previously been demined and completely cleaned. On that occasion, the Ukrainian forces used Uragan missiles of NATO production, which, in addition to the standard destructive effect, are equipped with cluster munition. Each of the rockets contained a large quantity of banned PMF-1 Lepestok anti-personnel mines. It completely paralyzed the city and the supply of food and water to the inhabitants for several days. From all of the above, it can be concluded that the Ukrainian side perceives civilians as well as prisoners of war as legitimate targets, and that it acts in order to achieve as many victims as possible among them, which is against all the rules of war and international humanitarian law. In addition, the weapons countries delivered to Ukraine in a large number of cases, 20 to 30%, through corrupt members of SBU and up in the third countries, often in the hands of destabilization of many regions. There are well-founded suspicions war in Yugoslavia represent a potential dangers for the outbreak of. There are indicators of renewed preparation for unrest in Kosovo and Metohija through extremist structures in order to increase the presence of NATO forces. The situation today is more than dangerous, and the hybrid war threatens to turn into direct conflict on a large scale, which in the condition of modern weapons calls into question the survival and future of our civilians. The Black Army, it is necessary to discuss involved in active conflict. Thank you very much for your attention.
Je vous remercie pour votre.
I thank you for your intervention. I will now give the floor to members of the Council who wish to make a statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, first of all, please allow me to express my heartfelt condolences to the United Kingdom and the people of the United Kingdom in the wake of the demise of their monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. We thank Ms. Nakamitsu and Ms. Trifkovic for their briefings. Unfortunately, part of the statement by Mr. Trifkovic we could not be heard, and we do hope that she will disseminate its text for the benefit of the members of the Security Council later. Mr. President, during the time that has elapsed since the beginning of the special military operation in Ukraine, we discussed various aspects of the situation. And we have a different view on the origin of the Ukrainian crisis, different from the Western members of the Council, as well as the transformations that the country undertook since the anti-constitutional coup in February 2014. It's clear why our former Western partners are doing what they're doing. They're trying to do everything they can to avoid the responsibility for the deterioration of independent Ukraine to enter Russia, to ignore the consistent 8 long years of the shelling by the Kievan regime of the people of Donbass, and the condoning the lack of desire of the Ukrainian authorities to implement the Minsk agreements. At the same time, most of the members understand how multifaceted the crisis is, and they understand that they're not to be found in the simplistic Western formulas about Russia's guilt. And this explains the desire to stop military hostilities, first and foremost, and look for solutions at the negotiating table. We hear appeals to peace from our colleagues in the developing countries, and we suggest that today we jointly analyze those factors which prevent the implementation of our wishes. We started our special operation to protect the people on Donbass in line with Article 51 of the UN Charter after the Kievan regime was being condoned of the Western sponsors shut the door on the Minsk process. This was a difficult decision, but it was made after it became clear that the use of force by Ukraine against the DNR and LNR was inevitable. And the documents we found, the documents of the Ukrainian General Staff, confirmed that. We also have the goal to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine so as to make sure that its territory can no longer be a threat to Donbass or Russia itself. As you all know, already a month after the beginning of the operation at Russia-Ukrainian negotiations, we basically agreed that the outline of our future peace agreements. And this peace seems so close that as a gesture of goodwill, we withdrew our forces from regions in Kiev, Chernigov, and Sumskaya Oblast. It was up to Kiev to make a move, and they were ready to make it, but then our Western partners interfered, and for them this was a disadvantage. Advantageous thing. And I'm referring to, first and foremost, to London and Washington, who issue commands at NATO. Since the illegal Maidan coup, Ukraine for them was of interest as a pawn in their geopolitical struggle to weaken Russia. And therefore, a peaceful scenario was not something that the UK or the US could be fine with. Envoys arrive in Kiev telling Mr. Zelensky that Zaev can do everything to make sure the Ukraine wins except direct military interference. It was said that the Ukraine is a place where the fate of world democracy is being decided. They made EU diplomat Mr. Borrell, who really crossed all diplomatic lines, said then, and I quote, that the outcome of this war will be decided on the field of battle. We also saw hysterics from Poland, Czechia, and the Baltic countries. Boris Johnson was egging Ukraine on a lot more than he was dealing with the problems of his own country. And also Mr. Biden was encouraging Kiev. As a result, as is well known, President Zelensky disavowed all of the agreements and, together with the British special forces, organized an egregious provocation in Bucha, and we lost the chance for peace. Therefore, the Ukrainian president committed a fatal mistake, fatal for his country. But today what we want to talk about is not that, but the role, rather, of our Western colleagues who have launched the largest scale proxy war in Russia using Ukrainians. So let's analyze what is happening today. NATO basically manually directs Kiev in the theater of war. The representatives of Ukrainian military intelligence publicly admitted that Washington is involved in agreeing every goal of the American HIMARS rocket systems. Ukraine is awash with Western military instructors, special services, and mercenaries. In a number of NATO countries, Ukraine military units are being trained. And at one of our previous meetings, we did say that in Czechia, in the military bases in Český Krumlov, saboteurs are being trained who are to conduct acts of terror in DNR. And we have information that Pentagon is planning to launch a mission for military and technical assistance to Kiev, and we've heard about similar plans from the EU. According to the most modest assessment, the United States and the allies only in the course of this year have already spent $20 billion to support Ukraine. According to the American mass media, the Biden administration is going to ask for emergency funding in the amount of $20 billion only in the first quarter of 2023. And the Ukrainians are being told consistently they're using modern Western weapons, the so-called Wunderwaffe. They will be able to to change the course of military campaign and become victorious over Russia. Let me not comment these empty fantasies, but let me just simply say that the consequences of this deceit of the population through President Zelensky and his entourage are very lamentable. lamentable for Ukraine, and we are very far still from the end of this destructive process. Let me say immediately, however, that the Western weaponry is not playing a decisive role on the battlefield, regardless of what the Ukrainians and their vassals are saying. The Russian army, consistently with minimal risk for soldiers and the civilians, is destroying not only the old weaponry of Soviet models, which the Eastern European countries are discharging, but also the modern NATO weapons. The difference is that using the long-range NATO artillery and rocket launchers, the Kiev regime is now striking civilian infrastructure and others which it didn't use to reach. And this resulted in the carnage in Yelenovka, shelling of Zaporozhye NBP, and the civilian areas of Donbass. Now, pumping Ukraine with weaponry which is used against civilian entities, the countries of the EU are violating their own common position rules which ban licensing the export of weapons if it creates a risk of a violation of international humanitarian law, and also requires taking into account the risk of uncoordinated re-export and illegal trafficking. The members of the EU also ignored another brainchild of yours, the International Arms Trade Treaty, which compels every state exporter to objectively assess whether this weaponry will undermine peace and security, whether that can be used to violate the international humanitarian law. The treaty directly bans the states to allow the transfer of conventional weapons if that state knows that it will be used to conduct acts of genocide, crimes against humanity, attacking civilian infrastructure or civilians.
In order to scrounge for new weapons, especially on the eve of the meeting of ministers of defense of NATO in Ramstein, the Zelensky regime has tried to create even the visibility of that Ukraine can launch an offensive. Countered the elementary principles of military strategy. Ukrainian propagandists in the highest levels of government openly shared plans of their offensive in order to return Ukrainian territories with the world community, which were often taken up by Ukrainian and Western media. Against this madness, which, as far as we can see, even the leadership of the armed forces of Ukraine was against it. However, the head of state of Ukraine, having spoken to American and British colleagues, was absolutely determined. As a result of this, the fields near Nikolaev and Zaporozhye and the forests near Kharkov are strewn with thousands of Ukrainian dead soldiers, which were sent to death and could not retreat due to anti-retreat units positioned behind them. Several minor villages were taken, but there can be no talk of any kind of breakthrough, and military experts understand this very well. However, the Western media has already claimed that Ukraine has shifted to a counteroffensive, and it is essential to support this with new Western weapons, so that the necessary media background was created for the meeting in Ramstein. This is precisely what Mr. Zelensky and his Western sponsors were trying to achieve. This means that the chances that further fuel will be poured into the Ukrainian conflict in the form of additional weapons deliveries, and this will continue. Will this change the situation on the field of battle? It will not in a significant way, and this most military experts agree on this. New weapons will not change the balance of forces and will only extend the agony of the Zelensky regime. It can also extend the suffering of the Ukrainian people, which has been sacrificed by the West in its geopolitical combat with Russia. And of course, it can only further the possibility of peace in Ukraine, for which the absolute majority of UN members has spoken in favor of. Let's look at who, in fact, wins from this scenario. The main beneficiaries, quite coincidentally, are those who are the loudest in beating the drums of war. The United States and Great Britain. Their military contractors are making huge profits, and their shares are increasing daily. Of course, it's clear that American and British weapons lobby will not forego such profits, and they're ready to put pressure on their politicians to continue this. Furthermore, Ukraine is not only a huge platform for recycling out obsolete NATO weapons, but it's also a testing ground to try new weapons and also to advertise weapons that will be exported. And the West will not lose this opportunity, obviously. So it would be naive to consider that Washington and London in the near future will change its warmongering rhetoric. So what will be the consequences and the risks of this situation for the world and for Europe? Well, of the most urgent risks, the spread of weapons that is resold by corrupt Ukrainian officials, and they're finding their way into the hands of terrorists and organized groups. Today's keynote speakers mentioned this. The head of Interpol back in June warned against the possibility of weapons flight from the Ukrainian territory to the black market. This threat is so huge that the armed forces of the Ukraine have already made fake implants of information about the possibility that Russia is supplying Western weapons to Europe. The situation is completely has become crazy. The Western military leadership openly recognizes that it cannot track the final user of its weapons. However, it must know that Ukrainian corrupt officials have already established links, channels in order to supply the black market with Western-made weapons. A significant proportion of these weapons finds itself in the hands of smugglers right from the warehouses. And in the dark net, you can find all kinds of offers to buy this weapon. We've already seen similar situations in the Balkans and the Middle East where Western military arsenals were then re-exported to Europe and then used by criminal groups on European territory or found their way into the hands of terrorists. However, the leadership of Western countries, unfortunately, has not drawn any lessons from this and is turning Ukraine into a global hub for illegal weapons supplies, which very soon might be used by terrorists in Europe, Asia, Middle East, and Africa. A particular threat is the spread of portable anti-air defense weapons and portable anti-tank missiles. These kinds of weapons pose huge risks for international civil aviation and rail transport. This is why precisely the circulation of these weapons is strictly regulated at the international level. NATO countries know this very well. In the 2000s, NATO spent considerable amounts of money to destroy excess supplies of portable anti-aircraft missiles in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Hungary, Chernogorия, and a number of other countries that were members of Partnership for Peace. The United States, understanding their danger in Afghanistan during the 1980s, also significantly spent a lot of money to buy back these weapons. Now Western countries are trying to arm Kiev, are violating all their international obligations, including in the framework of the Wassenaar Export Control Agreement. Now, of course, this situation objectively increases the risk of a direct a clash between NATO and Russia, even though they claim to do everything possible to avoid this. There are unfounded accusations against Russia of nuclear blackmail, whereas the new British Prime Minister Liz Truss openly confirmed the readiness to use nuclear weapons, and no one condemned her for such irresponsible statements. So, has NATO already crossed the red lines? Well, in 2020. Presidential candidate Joe Biden tried to accuse Russia that it had crossed red lines merely based on conjectures in the New York Times that Russia supposedly paid the Taliban to murder American soldiers in Afghanistan. The British members of Parliament have stated that the permanent members of the Security Council should not supply weapons or train insurgent fighters who did not allow Afghanistan to have peace. Using these same criteria, Western countries have have crossed these red lines a long time ago. Distinguished colleagues from the developing world, we convene this meeting so that you can understand the cynicism and mendacity of the countries of the collective West, and that their appeal, how cynical their appeals to so-called stop our war of choice. By creating a neo-Nazi hornet's nest at our borders and supporting the Kiev regime's war against their own people in 2014, they left us no choice. As President Putin said, we did not start this war, we will finish it. In other words, we're finishing a war which the Ukrainian regime, with the support of Western sponsors, began in 2014 against their own people. Our former Western partners do have a choice to continue supplying weapons to the conflict zone in spite of all international standards and their own declared principles, encouraging Ukrainians to, in their unrealistic quest to defeat Russia on the field of battle, or to force the Zelensky to come back to the table of negotiations and to try to deal with the root causes that led us to start the special military operation. All these reasons for the operation can be found in the actions of Ukraine or in the actions of the West. It's impossible to have any faith in the good sense of Western countries. They have more than once demonstrated that for the well-being of the 1%, or maintaining their domination in the world and containing their neocolonial policy, they're ready to commit any crimes and to engage in any adventures. And the fact that the world has changed start on the 24th of February only strengthens their determination to fight until the last Ukrainians. However, we do believe in the good sense of the developing world, of the countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and we hope that you will show that good sense in the interest not only of your countries but of humankind as a whole. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon. Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the High Representative of the Office of Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Izumu Nakamitsu, and the representative of the Civil Society, Ms. Dragana Trifkovic. I thank them for their respective briefings. Mr. President, this Council met the day before yesterday and is meeting once again this afternoon on the situation in Ukraine. And each of our meetings has to be geared towards looking for solutions so as to end the war. This war has already resulted in far too many deaths, far too much destruction of civilian infrastructure, and international economic consequences. We're very worried by the signs. They seem to be pointing towards progress, towards a war of attrition. Humanity certainly doesn't need that. In my country, I would like to reiterate a rejection of war. It's time to silence the guns in Ukraine. The greater number of weapons, of course, the greater number of dead, more war, more destruction, more misery, greater number of victims among civilian populations. The correlation between the weapons proliferation and insecurity is evident and manifest. We urge the parties to cease any and all escalation, be it verbal or military, or any action that can deepen the antagonisms. Mr. President, this council is a council for security, and it should be able to justify its name in each of its meetings. It is the prime place for us to fashion peace, and our energies have to every time go converging together towards finding a solution to this conflict. My country will without cease work within this logic of looking for peace and will stand side by side with those who propose ways which are alternatives to the language of weaponry. This war has to stop, and it has to stop very soon. The peoples of the world expect that we come up with specific proposals on how this could be ended. To conclude, I would like to express the condolences of my country to the people of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and tell them that we express every sympathy with you on the demise of Her Majesty Elizabeth II. Thank you. I thank the representative of Gabon for her statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Russia's unprovoked and illegal war is a violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and of the principles of the UN Charter. It is the most significant threat to international peace and security that the world currently faces. Ukraine has every right to defend itself under the UN Charter, legally and morally. It is doing so with great bravery. Ukraine is fighting not just for its existence. It is fighting in defense of the principles of the Charter itself and in defense of the UN system. And, President, Ukraine is succeeding. Thanks to the sacrifices of the Ukrainian people, we know that Putin's troops are tiring, that his losses are significant, that his supply lines are vulnerable, and his territorial gains are ephemeral. We have seen that Russia is struggling to maintain stocks of equipment, exacerbated by component shortages resulting from international sanctions which aim to end the war. And now, Russia is turning to Iran to supply UAVs, and, in a clear violation of UN sanctions, to North Korea to supply ammunition. There remains one simple way to end this war: for Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine and for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty to be restored. Any negotiation must be premised on this fundamental principle. President, the UK is proud to support the Ukrainian people. We will continue to do so in the face of Russia's assault on their sovereignty and territorial integrity. And we will continue to stand against this aggression and to stand for freedom, democracy, and the sovereignty of nations around the world. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Undersecretary General Nakamitsu, for your briefing today, especially with less than a day's notice from the Russian Federation. I'd like to begin by joining others in expressing our deepest condolences to the royal family and to the people of the United Kingdom, of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the Commonwealth of Nations on the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen lived an extraordinary life dedicated to service. Her legacy will loom large in the pages of British history and in the story of our world. Colleagues, before I go further, I think it's important that we're clear what this meeting today is about. This meeting is a transparent attempt to distract from the meeting yesterday on the forced displacement of Ukrainian citizens, where the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, clearly stated it had reports of torture in conjunction with Russia's abhorrent use of filtration camps. Moving on to address what we just heard from the Russian delegation, I would ask delegates to assess what we just heard in light of this fact. Earlier this year, we warned of Russia's premeditated intention to invade Ukraine, including an unprecedented buildup of military forces along Russia and Belarus's border with Ukraine. we recall the Russian delegation's fervent insistence in this very chamber and in a series of tweets and social media postings that its massive mobilization was only a routine military exercise. It had no plans to invade Ukraine. I think that says enough. But now Russia has the gall to blame other countries for refusing to step aside as it seeks to destroy another UN member state in violation of the Charter and international law. Like the United Kingdom, the United States is proud to stand with Ukraine and our allies and our partners from more than 50 countries in providing vital security assistance to support Ukraine's defense of its sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of Russian aggression. The United States is committed to supporting the people of Ukraine as they defend their lives, their liberty, and their democracy. We are not hiding this support. Ukraine and all UN member states have every right to defend themselves, and we will not stop our support to the Ukraine just because Russia is frustrated that its attempt at regime change has not gone to plan. Mr. President, later this month, leaders from around the world here will gather to reaffirm their commitment to the UN Charter and its foundational principles. It bears repeating, all countries have the inherent right of self-defense, consistent with Article 51 of the UN Charter. This is a simple, straightforward principle. Every member of the UN has a right to its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. I encourage all members of this Council to consider this question. If you were in Ukraine's shoes, how would you respond if a bigger neighbor invaded you? If your neighbor sent its armies into your cities, your lands, what would you do? What would you ask of the international community? None of us here would simply let our country's history and identity be attacked, our cities shelled to rubble, our people killed, our territory taken. We would appeal for international support in the face of such naked aggression. Russia's claims that the United States and the West is escalating and prolonging this conflict are false. They are cynical attempts to deflect attention from Moscow's role as the sole aggressor in what is an unnecessary and brutal war for which the world is paying a collective price. Let me be clear. The United States is not using force against Russia. President Biden has been clear. The United States does not seek a war between the United States and Russia, but we will not fail to condemn President Putin's choice to launch and pursue this invasion of Ukraine. Speaking of scrounging for weapons, as my Russian colleague did, even now Moscow is in the process of purchasing millions of rockets and artillery shells from the DPRK for use on the battlefield in Ukraine, which, as Ambassador Woodward said, would be a clear and unequivocal violation of Security Council resolutions. Before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine started, the United States, Ukraine, and our partners and allies engaged in intense diplomacy, seeking every avenue to diffuse conflict and find ways to address mutual concerns about security in Europe and beyond. Russia did not take this path. And now Ukraine is responding to this invasion as any of us would, by defending itself. We salute the armed forces of Ukraine and all Ukrainian citizens who continue to inspire the world with tremendous skill and profound courage. We have provided security assistance to allow Ukraine to defend itself and restore its control over its sovereign territory. But we are not just helping Ukraine defend itself. We are also helping Ukraine deal with the consequences of this awful war. The United States has also provided nearly $1.9 billion in humanitarian assistance in Ukraine and in the region since Russia first invaded Ukraine 8 years ago. We've channeled a total of $8.5 billion in budget support to Ukraine through World Bank mechanisms. We are also making sure any assistance to Ukraine's defense is responsible and limits unintended consequences. We take very seriously our responsibility to prevent the diversion or illicit proliferation of weapons, and we are working with Ukraine to ensure accountability of assistance, even amidst the challenging circumstances of war. The Ukrainian government has shown it takes this responsibility seriously as well. We welcome the Ukrainian government's recent announcement of its formation of a new commission to strengthen the monitoring of donated military equipment. In conclusion, Mr. President, let me say it again. War is not the answer. This conflict, Russia's atrocities, its filtration and forced displacement, the streams of refugees and displaced persons must end. But this will only happen when Russia decides to respect and comply with the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. The government of Ghana has learned with great sorrow the passing away of Her Royal Majesty Queen Elizabeth II in the earlier hours of today. We are deeply saddened by the loss of the United Kingdom's longest-serving monarch and head of the Commonwealth of Nations. This is a moment of great sadness for the many across the world who cherished and held the Queen in high esteem as a person and a sovereign. On behalf of the government and people of Ghana, we offer our most profound condolences to the royal family, the government and people of the United Kingdom, and the permanent mission of the United Kingdom to the United Nations. Mr. President, at the outset, I wish to thank USG Nakamitsu, the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, for her briefing. We have also taken note of the contributions made by the civil society representative. The Security Council is meeting for the third time in 3 days to discuss once again the war on Ukraine. While we note the continuing interest on the aggression against Ukraine, we are also seriously concerned that the meetings of this Council have not constructively supported diplomatic actions required in the immediate term at ending the hostilities and assisting the parties in finding a mutually acceptable, comprehensive, and lasting solution to the conflict that lies between them. As we have stated previously and consistent with international law, the Charter of the United Nations, the decision of the International Court of Justice, and the resolutions of the 11th Emergency Session of the General Assembly, the invasion against Ukraine, a sovereign member of this organization, is unjustified. With the war showing little signs of abatement and considering its unique circumstances, we believe it is important for the international community to devote all efforts towards finding a pacific solution to the conflict, but in a manner which also ensures that there are no benefits accorded to parties whose ab initio actions are unacceptable under international law. We must continue to work to remove the real risk of the conflict engulfing the whole European continent, leading to a generalized and widespread conflict with devastating consequences for all humanity. We therefore call for the de-escalation of tensions and urge all relevant actors to conduct themselves in a manner that encourages confidence building and fosters trust and reconciliation. We note with deep concern the resumption of shelling near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, despite the clear and looming risk that it presents to Ukraine and the world at large. We call for greater cooperation by the parties to realign the status quo at the ZNPP to the 7 pillars of nuclear safety and security outlined by the IAEA, and reiterate the call for the urgent delineation of a safe zone around the plant. Ghana encourages the sustained commitment of all parties and relevant actors to the Black Sea Grain Initiative to help bring critical food aid to people in other parts of the world where farming conditions exist and populations, including children, lie at the brink of starvation. Rising fuel prices are rapidly translating to elevated and unprecedented cost of living standards, especially in developing countries. Increasingly, life is becoming unbearable and tensions appear to be festering among populations in the scramble for survival. We must therefore work together to find sustainable solutions and prevent the worsening energy crisis from degenerating into a global security crisis. Mr. President, as noted by the Secretary General in his statement on Tuesday, we need peace in Ukraine. Peace that is founded on nothing less than the norms and principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Ghana stands firm in the conviction that only diplomacy and dialogue would avail the peaceful solution which the military engagements have so far failed to deliver. In concluding, I reaffirm Ghana's continuing and unwavering support for the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. I thank you for your kind attention.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Ghana for your statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Mexico. Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I would like to begin, of course, by expressing to the delegation of the United Kingdom the solidarity of Mexico in connection with the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, who embodied a sense of duty and service to her people. I thank the High Representative Nakamitsu for her briefing, and we also take note of the information provided by Madam Trufkovic. Before getting into the substance, Madam President, I would like to recall that on various occasions my delegation has referred to the importance and the need to focus on the possible implications of the transfer of weapons in connection with the conflict in Ukraine. There's no doubt that this is an issue of utmost importance. However, taking into consideration the time we have had throughout this crisis to incorporate this extremely important topic into our discussions, my delegation would like to express its surprise about the haste with which this meeting was convened and scheduled. Topics of this importance, especially when they're predictable, must be scheduled sufficiently in advance and without having to improvise. Even more, we would say that we'd like to reiterate that consideration by the Council on this topic should lead to concrete steps in order to fulfill its primary responsibility on maintaining international peace and security in conformity with the Charter. Since the beginning of the war, we have met at least 27 times. And so far, the Council has limited itself to issuing barely one presidential declaration promoted by Norway and Mexico, expressing profound concern about the situation in Ukraine and, of course, expressing support for the efforts of the Secretary General in seeking a peaceful solution. This, from every point of view, is absolutely insufficient, taking into account the severity of this crisis. We regret that in the face of this crisis, the Council has limited itself to deliberating and continuing to deliberate, leaving aside the decision-making authority conferred to it by the Charter to ensure rapid and effective action by the United States in the face of a violation of peace or undermining of peace or an act of aggression. Madam President, the concern of Mexico regarding arms transfers is not limited to the current situation and, of course, includes arms transfers that have been happening since the beginning of the conflict in the eastern part of Ukraine in 2013. As long as the Security Council does not assume its responsibility in the face of a situation of invasion in which Ukraine finds itself, we have to, of course, we have to, we recognize the right to legitimate defense and the right to acquire arms for its defense. However, This should always go hand in hand with the protections and safeguards that are necessary to minimize risks, avoid their diversion, or that these weapons could be used to commit severe violations and systematic violations of human rights or international humanitarian law. We have taken note of the declarations regarding precautions practiced by exporters who have sold or supplied weapons. That being said, the extremely high volume of arms transfers necessarily implies a degree of loss of control on the life cycle of these weapons, which obviously increases the risks inherent in trafficking and diversion. Criminal organizations will certainly be very interested in exploiting these gaps and lacuna. We must also keep in mind the implications of the proliferation of weapons in possession of civilians. If we should have learned something from recent history, is that these kinds of situations lead to trafficking of weapons towards other conflict areas, as we have clearly seen in the case of the Sahel. In addition to putting at risk hopes for peace in a post-conflict situation, we also must recognize the impact that is derived from the use of all kinds of weapons. The highest price is always paid by civilians because residential zones are destroyed, infrastructure and civilian targets are attacked deliberately, and railways, schools, and hospitals even are bombed. Explosive weapons with indiscriminate effects have become the use of these weapons has become a daily occurrence, and this is absolutely unacceptable. Madam President, transfers of weapons, these kinds of transfers go back to about 10 years ago. It is almost unimaginable what a decade of the flow of weapons could mean and the effects that this will have in the future. The organization Conflict Armaments Research published a report in 2021 that provided detailed information on the transfers between 2018 and 2020 towards the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. The investigations point to the supply of a broad range of weapons and munitions, mostly coming from neighboring countries. The report also highlights the practice of erasing deliberately the markings on weapons to avoid any attempt to trace the origin of the weapons. And all this in contravention of multiple norms, political agreements, and legally binding instruments in the area of weapons transfers. In addition to, let's say, more traditional or conventional weapons, various reports, including the report by the authorities of the Netherlands, point to the transfer of a system called Buk of surface-to-air missiles, which led to the shooting down of flight MH17 of the Malaysian Airlines in the east of Ukraine in 2014. This is just one concrete example of the terrible consequences that the irresponsible transfer of weapons could cause, and that caused the deaths of hundreds of passengers in a commercial airliner that had no connection at all to the conflict in Ukraine. Madam President, in the face of the unfortunate prospect of the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine, the international community must be unequivocal in demanding a responsibility with regard to the transfer of weapons. We call on all countries that are parties or signatories of the Arms Trade Treaty, ATT, to fully adhere to its provisions, especially with regard to the denial or to denial of transfers of weapons that are clearly in violation of the treaty, and an application of the strict risk analysis as stipulated in the treaty. But also, we call on those countries that are not yet parties to the ATT to to comply in a responsible way with the highest standards of precaution in their transfers based on criteria of objectivity and beyond simply private interests or geostrategic calculations. The mitigation measures, including no re-export clauses and clear final use clauses, must be part and parcel of these calculations and part and parcel of any agreement on the transfer of weapons. And clearly, the top priority should be a commitment to actively monitor the situation of human rights and respect for international humanitarian law with regard to any supplies of weapons in the future. But beyond the decisions that are taken today for the approval of additional supplies or transfers, the time has also come, Madam President, to establish concrete measures for arms control in the post-conflict period. In conclusion, Mr. President, I would like to stress that a military solution will never be the right solution. And it's time for the international community to focus on promoting diplomatic understandings that lead to the end of this war, rather than the supplies of weapons and the continuation of a conflict whose outcome is unfortunately very uncertain. Thank you very much.
Je remercie le représentant.
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Mr. President, let me join colleagues and express our most sincere condolences to our British colleagues and through them to the British royal family and all British and Commonwealth citizens for the passing away of Queen Elizabeth II. We pay tribute to her unique contribution to building peace and reconciliation, and our thoughts are all those grieving today. Mr.
President, I would like to thank Ms. Nakamitsu for the information she provided.
Mr. President, the right title of the meeting today should have been Worldwide Solidarity and Support for a Country that has been brutally attacked by its neighbor, whose intentions are to wipe it from the map. Because, in our view, this is all we can discuss about here today, and not about weapons and calibers, including those that, reportedly, Iran and North Korea, two countries under sanctions, are unlawfully providing to Russia. There are mechanisms and instruments for this, and they work very well, and we agree on the need to strengthen them further. Therefore, for this delegation, the meeting is about solidarity, help, and support to a country in need. During these long 6 months, beyond the brutality of a war of choice, the world has witnessed two remarkable experiences. First, the heroic and unwavering resistance of the Ukrainian people, army, and government. And second, the incredible solidarity and support of the international community with Ukraine. And as we know, solidarity, help and support come in different ways and different forms. They did on the 2nd of March with a resolution when 141 UN member states stood on one side with Ukraine, on the right one, and 4 only on the other with Russia. They did and continue every day with vivid expressions of sympathy on the streets of almost every capital in the world who have proudly displayed Ukraine's colors. They come with all forms of assistance for those millions brutally uprooted from their homes who are welcomed and cared for in neighboring countries. They come through humanitarian help for those many more millions, who need food on the table, milk for their babies, medicine for the sick, and shelter for those whose homes have been turned to rubble by Russian bombs. They come also, and so rightfully so, in the form of a direct defensive military aid to a government and people who are under premeditated, unprovoked, unjustified, indefensible, unacceptable attack by a neighbor who wishes you well by throwing bombs and destroying your homes. And no, there are no warring parties in Ukraine. There is an aggressor and a country rightfully defending itself. We also could not hear entirely Madam Trifkovic, but please don't bother to distribute the statement since we can easily complete the missing part of propaganda. Mr. President, since the very beginning of this madness, it has been clear Russia's aggression is not only against Ukraine and its people, it is also an aggression on international law, on UN Charter, and a danger for European security architecture. Therefore, standing for Ukraine and helping Ukraine today is both a moral duty not to let down 44 million souls that Kremlin wants to subjugate, but also a key security imperative. Albania is proud to be part of those who are doing what they can to help Ukraine and Ukrainians defend themselves. Mr. President, no one better than us here around this table knows what sovereignty, independence, and right to self-defense are and mean. Article 51 of the UN Charter is clear. It provides an unquestionable legal basis for individual states to offer whatever assistance to a country exercising its inherent right to self-defense in defense of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Therefore, taking a collective stand against an illegal war of conquest is the right course and a contribution to future security in Europe and beyond. In the face of deliberate and barbaric targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, with widespread evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity, standing for Ukraine is standing for life. Mr. President, we understand the clear intentions to slice the Ukraine tragedy into pieces of discussions, zooming into specific aspects for specific interest and push a certain narrative. It will not succeed, and we don't buy it. We will always agree to thoroughly discuss every aspect on an issue, but let's not lose sight of the big picture, and that means why we have this war and who is responsible for it and all its consequences. Russia has started the war. Russia is responsible. Russia can end it any time. Therefore, Ukraine war and solidarity with Ukrainians is all about protecting freedom, peace, security, development, prosperity, friendly relations, fair trade with mutual benefits, principles and values, laws and commitments, and the UN Charter. Our solidarity is against Kremlin's reckless actions, meaning against aggression, invasion, war crimes, crimes against humanity, widespread destruction, killing of civilians, including children, forced deportation, food insecurity leading to starvation, world economic and trade disruption, disrespect for international law. Because all these are in total opposition to everything we commonly aspire for in our efforts to make the world a better place. But a better place for all, not just for Kremlin and its expansionist dreams. Russia did not go to Ukraine with flowers, but with guns. There is no surprise that it was not welcomed with flowers, but with guns, and, as we see, outgunned. Let's not forget, colleagues, if Russia wins the war, there may be no Ukraine. Who would be so naive to believe that Russia would stop there if we allow it? Thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
President, at the outset, our deepest condolences to the UK. The Prime Minister of India has tweeted that Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II will be remembered as a stalwart of our times. She provided inspiring leadership to her nation and people. She personified dignity and decency in public life. I am pained by her demise. My thoughts are with her family and the people of the UK in this sad hour. Turning to the topic at hand, our thanks to USG Nakamitsu for her detailed briefing. We also thank the civil society briefer for her remarks. Mr. President, we believe that internationally agreed principles and regimes should be respected and upheld by all countries. This Council would recall that since the commencement of the conflict in Ukraine, India has been consistently calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities and for an end to violence. We have emphasized that dialogue and diplomacy are the only way forward. In our view, it is regrettable, therefore, that the situation in Ukraine has not shown any significant improvement despite regular Council discussions, today's meeting being the third in as many days in this week alone. Meantime, Mr. President, we very much hope that the international community will continue to respond positively to calls for humanitarian assistance. India has recently dispatched its 12th consignment of humanitarian aid to Ukraine. This assistance is in keeping with the human-centric approach of the Government of India, a central tenet of our national beliefs and values, which perceive the whole world as one family. Going forward, Mr. President, India's approach will be to continue to promote dialogue and diplomacy with an overarching aim to end the conflict and work with other partners to mitigate the economic challenges emerging from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It is in our collective interest to work constructively, both inside the United Nations and outside, towards seeking an early resolution to this conflict. We continue to reiterate that the global order be anchored on international law, the UN Charter, and respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de
I thank the representative of India for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President, and allow me to use this opportunity to, with a deep sense of sadness and on behalf of Kenya's delegation, convey our deepest condolences to the royal family, the people, and the government of the United Kingdom, as well as our colleagues at the UK Permanent Mission on the demise of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. She will be remembered for her exemplary sense of duty and leadership for our people and Commonwealth throughout our 7 decades on the throne. I thank USG Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu and Ms. Dragana Trikovic for their briefings. Today, this Council meets for the 3rd time in 3 days over the situation in Ukraine. This time to discuss the supply of weapons. However, underlying this discussion and the ones preceding it is the challenge of how to collectively build a stable and peaceful global order. We continue to have extreme concern about the ruinous damage the war is causing to Ukrainian lives, to Ukraine's legitimate right to its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and to regional and international security. However, even as the Security Council debates the conduct of the war, as we are doing today, and we urge for every effort to stop it, we must be more responsive to our fundamental mandate to protect international peace and security in a comprehensive manner. In our view, this means that this Council and the international community need to fully face up to the strategic thinking that led to this war and the allied responses to it. We should act to minimize the risk of escalation while establishing channels of dialogue that will lead to a stable global order. Our countries are suffering forms of harm due to this war. In Africa, our aspirations for development, for united and comprehensive action against climate change, and for security are deteriorating due to its direct and indirect impacts. The mobilization of militarized alliances, the utilization of sanctions, blockades, cyber attacks, the use of proxy in third countries, and the undermining of multilateral institutions are robbing us of the ability to collectively resolve our most serious challenges. They are distorting the global economy by shifting the patterns of trade and investment. This is undermining the engine of globalization that most countries sought to recruit in their search for growth and development. It is in the interest of the entire global community, and in particular the developing countries, for the ending of this war to usher in a new age of global peace and cooperation. We urge the warring parties and their allies and partners to enter into comprehensive discussions on a set of guidelines that will reanimate their willingness to modify their strategic posture in accord to the United Nations Charter. Those discussions should be guided by identifying areas where cooperation is necessary and achievable. For instance, in undertaking ambitious climate change mitigation and adaptation, and in supporting a trade and investment regime that is open enough not to undermine worldwide economic development. They should honestly face each other's most serious security concerns and undertake regular dialogue to clarify positions, minimize misunderstanding, and reverse risks of escalation. The spirit and the letter of the UN Charter offer the fundamental template. Its application should be guided by the honest appraisal that it has so far not proven a sufficient constraint to the illegal actions of the most powerful states as they assert or protect their interests. Rather than this reality causing a further rupture in multilateralism, all countries, and particularly opposed military powers, should understand that the Charter can still be of great service to all of them if it is applied through cooperation, compromise, and de-escalation. Every region should, in addition, also reflect this approach to identify and clarify regional areas and sectors for cooperation and undertake dialogue guided by the security concerns of neighboring countries. We again call for a cessation of hostilities and for a political settlement that respects the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to join previous speakers in conveying our deepest condolences to the permanent representative of the United Kingdom, to our friends and colleagues at the mission of the United Kingdom, and to the people of the United Kingdom on the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. As the world mourns her departure, we in Brazil will remember with fondness her trip to our country, where she was received with great warmth. Her decades-long sense of duty and devotion to her people will not be forgotten. Mr. President, I would like to thank Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, Izumi Nakamitsu, for her tireless work in what has been an extremely intense and yet frustrating few weeks in the disarmament file. I would also like to welcome the participation of Ms. Dragana Trifkovic from the Center for Geostrategic Studies. We cannot but be disheartened at yet another meeting in this chamber, the third this week, on the topic of Ukraine. This conflict has dragged on for over 6 months, and despite the constant discussions in this Council, we have not been successful in fostering a suspension of hostilities. Brazil has made its position clear since the outbreak of hostilities, both in this Council and in the General Assembly. We hold the firm conviction that threats and force will not lead this crisis to a lasting settlement. Military action inflicts damage, undermines faith in international law, and jeopardizes millions of people's lives. We remain deeply concerned by the humanitarian impact of the conflict and convinced that there is no alternative to the negotiation of a ceasefire as a first step on the way to solving the present crisis. Mr. President, as a party to the Arms Trade Treaty, Brazil abides by the set of principles outlined in that legal instrument and believes they offer a valuable guideline for the transfer of arms. First, the treaty highlights the importance of respecting and ensuring respect for international humanitarian law and for human rights law, regardless of military objectives or security concerns. Secondly, it urges states to effectively regulate their arms trade so as to prevent diversion through systems of effective national control. These principles should serve the objectives which we also believe are applicable to the present crisis of promoting responsible action in arms trade, building confidence, reducing human suffering, and contributing to international and regional peace, security, and stability. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, and before I begin, I would also like to join other colleagues in expressing the heartfelt condolences of the United Arab Emirates to the government and people of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland on the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Having celebrated the 70th Jubilee this past summer, Her Majesty's reign spanned an intense period of our modern world, and there is a lot to be said that will be remembered about Her Majesty's long, well-lived and remarkable life. But at the moment, I shall limit myself to this. We stand together with the United Kingdom at this difficult time, and we want to express how truly inspired we have been by Queen Elizabeth's duty to and life in service of her people. As we mourn Her Majesty's passing, we must also celebrate an extraordinary life and Her Majesty's achievements and legacy, which lives on. To the subject of today's meeting, I'd like to thank High Representative Nakamitsu for her updates, and I also take note of the briefing of Ms. Drikovic. We have met, as others have said, countless times to discuss the war in Ukraine, its causes, and its consequences. We don't forget that what is happening in Ukraine is a result of the war. But as I've emphasized before here in this chamber, while the past cannot be changed, we still can have an impact on the present and the future trajectory of this conflict. That is why this topic does deserve our attention in the correct forum and with the technical expertise required to fully discuss it. The UAE has advocated over and over for a cessation of hostilities and peaceful settlement to the conflict. To get to a peaceful end to the conflict, any action taken by the parties or other stakeholders needs to be measured and deliberate. The war has been raging for over 6 months now and sadly risks settling into a protracted conflict with both sides intent on military victory. We should not resign ourselves to this reality, and the countless lives at stake depend on that. This war won't end militarily. Sooner or later, and we hope it is sooner, there will have to be real dialogue and a political solution based on respect for sovereignty, international law, and the UN Charter. Let's make sure that the strategic objective of peace is not undermined by the immediate military tactics of war. The pursuit of the maintenance of international peace and security is rarely a simplistic equation. As long as armed conflicts remain a brutal part of our reality, we must recognize the importance of striving for the safe and secure transfer of weapons. It is crucial that the ultimate recipient of arms and ammunition be accounted for so that down the line such weapons do not inadvertently end up in the hands of terrorists. History has taught us the danger of focusing on short-term objectives and of ignoring the longer-term implications of the flow of lethal weapons in the calculus of decisions about the supply, transfer, stockpiling, and safe storage of arms. We note in this regard with concern the warnings expressed by Interpol's Secretary General back in June about the dangers of the availability of weapons and the real possibilities of criminal groups exploiting the proliferation of these weapons. This is especially dangerous in the case of smaller, easily portable, light weapons. We support Interpol's calls for suppliers to track and trace the weapons entering Ukraine in order to minimize the risk of any potential increase in transnational crime and regional instability during and after the conflict. The geopolitical tensions rising across the globe risk undermining the very mechanisms we have in place to manage conflict, promote stability, and ensure prosperity and development for all of our nations. For example, they're having wider ramifications on global arms control, as demonstrated by the lack of an agreed outcome at the 10th Review Conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the cornerstone of the nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament regime. The recent terrorist attacks by al-Shabaab in Somalia or heavy weaponry displays by the Houthi terrorists in Yemen serve as continuous reminders of the risks associated with the limited enforcement of the existing arms control mechanisms. Unless we do something, the proliferation of small and light weapons will continue to grow exponentially. Mr. President, let me end by noting that this is, indeed, as others have said, the third time that the Council has met in 3 days to discuss issues related to the conflict in Ukraine. It demonstrates the gravity of the situation and the multifaceted nature of the challenges we face. At the same time, we must ensure that we are able to make headway on other important issues on the Council's agenda, and that dynamics driven by this issue do not spill over or impact our ability to forge consensus on other crucial files. To do so, we must redouble our efforts to achieve tangible results in a range of unresolved issues which deserve our equal attention, from the Middle East to Africa and around the world. The Council has a responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, and we must seek to discharge that duty to the fullest possible extent. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. And at the outset, may I also join with other colleagues in conveying our deepest condolences to Ambassador Woodward, her team, and indeed the British people on the passing of Queen Elizabeth. We in Ireland recall with particular affection her state visit to Ireland in 2011, the first by a serving British monarch since independence. That visit not only helped to consolidate and cement the Northern Ireland peace process, but also affirmed the close bonds of friendship and affection between our two peoples and two islands. It was a moment of genuine healing and reconciliation, and we thank her for that. May she rest in peace. Mr. President, I would like to thank USG Nakamitsu for her briefing, and we note also the presence of Ms. Trifkovic. Ireland believes in and is fully committed to the core principles enshrined in the UN Charter. These include the sovereign equality and the territorial integrity of states. Ukraine has the same fundamental right as every other sovereign and independent state to choose its own foreign policy and to ensure the security and defence of its own territory. As the General Secretary has said, the principles of the Charter are not an à la carte menu. Article 2, paragraph 4 applies to all UN members, just as Article 51 does. There are no exceptions and there is no waiving of these principles. Let us not forget that in the weeks leading up to Russia's illegal and unjustifiable further invasion of Ukraine last February, Ukraine showed remarkable restraint in the face of Russia's military build-up at its border and in the face of its provocative propaganda. The decision by Russia to recognise as independent entities the non-government controlled areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine has not changed those borders one iota. They did not change in 2014 and they have not changed since. Mr. President, Ukraine did not commit or threaten to commit an armed attack against Russia. It was Russia which attacked Ukraine, and it was Russia which sought to justify its invasion by invoking Article 51 of the UN Charter. It is Russia which would now seek to deny to a fellow UN member that same right of self-defence. Contrary to some claims, there is no credible evidence of diversion and no indication that exports are taking place other than in accordance with national laws and international procedure. This includes military support provided by the European Union to help Ukraine exercise its inherent right of self-defence and defend its territorial integrity and sovereignty. We would ask that Russia stop trying to use the Security Council as a platform for its disinformation campaign to paint itself as the victim of its own aggression in the face of the heinous acts it has committed in Ukraine. Once again, we call on Russia to desist. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me also here to express Norway's heartfelt condolences to the royal family, to the people of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, and our colleagues on the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. President, I thank High Representative Nakamitsu for her statement and take note of Ms. Trifkovic's briefing. Let me make 4 short points today. First, Norway reiterates that Russia's war on Ukraine is a serious violation of international law. Russia must abide by the order of the International Court of Justice and immediately suspend its military operations in the territory of Ukraine. Second, we reiterate our unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Third, we call on Russia to immediately end their indiscriminative attacks. Norway unequivocally condemns all violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, including the reported killings of Ukrainian civilians and strikes on civilian infrastructure. Finally, Mr. President, Ukraine has a right to defend itself against Russia's armed attack as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Other states are entitled to respond positively to Ukraine's call for assistance in the exercise of its legitimate self-defense. The simple fact remains, what is blatantly illegal is Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Russia must fully and unconditionally withdraw its forces and military equipment from Ukraine. Russia started this war and must now choose to stop it. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, on behalf of the Chinese delegation, I wish to express our deep condolences over the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and convey our sincere sympathy to our colleagues of the Permanent Mission of the UK and through them to the government and people of the UK. Mr. President, I wish to thank USG Nakamitsu for her briefing. We have also listened carefully to the statement of Ms. Trifkovich. The crisis in Ukraine, which has lasted for more than 6 months, has fully demonstrated the tremendous human suffering brought about by weapons and ammunition. To date, fierce fighting is still raging on in various places, and more weapons and ammunition are flowing to the battlefield, giving rise to a worrying prospect of a prolonged and expanded conflict. Since the beginning of the crisis in Ukraine, China has consistently emphasized that the supply of weapons will not bring peace. Adding fuel to fire will only complicate the problem. The harsh reality and humanitarian consequences of the past 6 months have fully demonstrated this. Equally worrying is the scenario that a large number of weapons and ammunition falling into the wrong hands, causing endless trouble and creating security risks in Ukraine and in a wider area. We have noticed that relevant negative impact already began to emerge. There's no lack of lessons in this regard. In Afghanistan, up to $7 billion worth of weapons and equipment have been discarded at will upon the hasty withdrawal of foreign troops, prompting rampant black markets in which weapons are openly sold in broad daylight, and they are easily accessible to anyone, even children. These weapons will be a long-term obstacle to rebuilding lasting peace in Afghanistan and will also pose huge risks to the security of the regional countries. In Somalia, the firearms left by foreign troops in the 1990s have now become easily available to terrorists who use them to kill or engage in violence, threatening the lives of local civilians, including women and children. In China, in the 1930s and the 1940s, invaders left behind chemical weapons that are still seriously threatening our people's lives, the safety of their properties, and the ecological environment. Mr. President, China has always maintained that dialogue and negotiation is the most realistic and feasible way to resolve the crisis. Only by seeking common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security can there be long-term stability and security in Europe and in the world. The Ukrainian crisis once again proved to us in a brutal way that pursuing power politics, seeking absolute security, obsessing with military power and creating division and confrontation cannot bring peace and stability, nor can they bring reconciliation and tranquility. All parties concerned should remain in contact and communication and leave room for diplomatic negotiations so as to create conditions for political settlement, so as to see the ceasefire and cessation of hostilities at an early date. I would like to stress again that on the issue of Ukraine, China has always believed that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be followed. The legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously, and every effort conducive to the peaceful resolution of the crisis should be supported. We will continue to stand on the side of peace, the side of dialogue, and on the side of humanity, and will play a constructive role in the proper settlement of the crisis in Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of France. Earlier, in my national capacity, I would like to yet once again express to the UK delegation our condolences, the condolences of my delegation, and re-express the friendship the French people feel towards the British people. I would like to thank Ms. Nakamitsu for her briefing. On the 24th of February last, Russia invaded Ukraine, flouting the international law and the United Nations Charter. Members of this council will recall that a week earlier, on the 17th of February, in this very council, the deputy minister of Russian Federation who were presiding described such a scenario as Western paranoia. And by doing that, Russia imposed on the entire world a war with major consequences, humanitarian consequences, food, energy, and nuclear consequences. And we have to acknowledge the fact that Russia alone bears the responsibility for the current situation. It is Russia which feeds it every day by continuing on the ground its armed aggression. France made a determined choice to help Ukraine to defend its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. And we did this because today Ukraine is fighting for the values and principles which are also ours, which are also the principles contained in the United Nations Charter. Territorial integrity, independence and sovereignty of states, rejection of territorial conquest by force, condemning wars of aggression. And it is our duty, and it is within the purview of this Council to defend these rules, as they alone provide for international peace and stability. And that is why France, in its national capacity, provides military support, which helps provide Ukraine with the means to defend itself. And we also are working at the level of the European Union, where a collective decision was made to fund weapons, which are needed to make sure that Ukraine can withstand the Russian aggression. We would like to create the conditions which would enable, at the time of Ukraine's choosing, either a military victory or negotiated peace under the terms which would be different from the terms it would have to accept if we abandoned Ukraine to its fate. And this military assistance will continue for as long as armed Russian aggression will continue, as will continue our humanitarian, economic, and political assistance to Ukraine. Russia, we've said that, is alone responsible for this war that is waging against Ukraine and imposing on the world entire. France vehemently rejects the arguments put forward by those who would have us believe that this war and its continuation is the work of the Ukrainians or the Europeans. Let us not reverse responsibilities here. And France will continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainians who are fighting to defend their sovereignty. If we want to silence the guns, the solution is very well known. It was provided to us by International Court of Justice on the 16th of March. Russia has to immediately cease all of its military operations in Ukraine. It has to withdraw from the Ukrainian territory and respect its internationally recognized borders. It must stop its dangerous rush forward. I now resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the Russian Federation who has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor. Mr. President, today our Western colleagues didn't have anything to do on the topic at hand because the facts bear their not only direct but also indirect participation in this proxy war. And that is why they use their favorite tactic of shifting the accent away from the topic of the meeting and moving them into something that we're all used to by now, namely accusing Russia. Well, commenting on the speculations by our American and British comments about filtration camps, tortures, and the brutality of the Russian army, we're not going to do again. We did this on many occasions, including yesterday. But we did notice the statement made by the Western backers of Kiev, saying that they're only providing Kiev with defensive weaponry. It's using these defensive weapons that the Kiev regime is shelling not the Russian military, but the civilian residential areas of Donbass. Another thing that I paid attention to that is a certain statement made by the UK and the US when they said that Russia is buying weaponry from Iran and DPRK. I would like to ask them now to either provide us with evidence of that or they acknowledge that they are disseminating unreliable information to members of the Council. And let me state right away that the publications to this effect in Western media and comments thereupon and conjectures made and inconclusive statements made by American officials cannot be considered such evidence. Even though recently, as was already stated several times, we're not surprised by anything. Any statement by mass media is almost automatically being used by Western partners as a proper accusation against Russia. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, I also recognize here the representative of terrorist Russia in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. I would like to thank USG Izumi Nakamitsu for her briefing. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. In her 2008 Christmas TV broadcast, Queen Elizabeth II said what's today one of her most famous quotes. Not only famous today, but is very relevant to the tragic events in Europe as a result of the illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war of Russia against Ukraine, against the entire civilized world. Queen Elizabeth II said, and I quote, "When life seems hard, the courageous do not lie down and accept defeat. They are all the more determined to struggle for a better future." End of quote. The world will miss the Queen's wisdom. Let Her Majesty rest in peace. By launching its aggression against Ukraine in 2014, by invading Ukraine in February 2022, Russia has violated the norms and principles of practically all fundamental international documents, including bilateral and multilateral agreements, the Helsinki Final Act, and first and foremost, the UN Charter. No one on this planet but Damascus and Pyongyang would doubt this, and it makes no sense to waste the Security Council's already wasted time on substantiating this point. Let me just refer to the UN General Assembly resolution adopted at the 11th Emergency Special Session on the 2nd of March by an overwhelming majority of 141 member states, and which deplores in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine in violation of Article 2.4 of the Charter. International law guards the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. International law explicitly confers on us the inherent right to self-defense, enshrined in particular in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Not a single state present in this chamber, besides Russia, is responsible for the Council's inability to effectively perform its functions under the UN Charter. It is solely the presence of Russia in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union that has immobilized the Security Council in relation to ensuring the peace and security of Ukraine. We are defending ourselves, Europe, the world, and the UN Charter. And we will keep on fighting until the last inch of the sovereign territory of Ukraine, including Crimea, is liberated. I emphasize in strict accordance with the provisions of Article 51 of the UN Charter that we all have committed to uphold. We will fight against the occupiers until all the Russian soldiers who entered Ukraine to kill its people are defeated. The only thing that Putin can do to save the lives of his soldiers is to order their immediate withdrawal. The level of human suffering and destruction in Ukraine, the level of the global implications of the Russian war of aggression make it clear that fighting Putin today can only be compared to our common fight against Hitler during the Second World War. Let me remind you that the document entitled the Declaration by the United Nations, and this was the first time that the term United Nations was used, was signed in 1942 in Washington, D.C. to unite the peoples throughout the globe in their struggle against the Nazis. As former Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev wrote in his memoirs, and I quote, "If the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war," end of quote. Even dictator Stalin offered the same opinion earlier in Tehran in 1943. It was due to this global unity, due to Lend-Lease, due to the assistance of the American people and other allies, that we succeeded defeating Hitler. The evil of Putin, as that of Hitler before him, requires a global response. This was the case during the Second World War. This is the case right now, and Ukraine and its allies are doing their best to ensure such a response. The liberation of Ukrainian territories that is well on the way in the Kharkiv and Kherson regions serves as the best proof of the effectiveness of our efforts. The Russian Federation has already abused the Security Council on many occasions, including this week. We call on Russia to learn to respect this body. It is apparent, however, that the Russian delegation has a lot of delusions, false beliefs that are not based in reality, hallucinations, seeing or hearing things that do not exist, and an endless list of other negative symptoms. It is indeed a difficult condition, but let me suggest that those symptoms should be studied and treated not in this chamber and not by diplomats. They require a different type of qualification and different offices. Perhaps less than a mile from the UN headquarters on the same First Avenue. So take them there and ask for therapy. Yes, there is only one truly right avenue to save the lives of thousands of Ukrainian and, in fact, Russian citizens. That is to surrender and withdraw. If that does not happen, no therapy, however, will help. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for his statement. There are no further speakers on the list. The meeting is adjourned.